Hello and welcome to Wisdom and Productivity, the podcast of Dr. Efraín Martinez. I am a principal in search of wisdom, and I have found productivity to be a great tool for success. Today, I have the great and distinguished honor to interview Dr. Susana Held, who is a bilingual school psychologist who works as a dean of students at Leyden High School District 212, an advocate, a lifelong learner, a world adventurer, a lover of books, and a photography enthusiast. I can't wait to learn all about all of this. Susie, who are you?
Well, good morning.
Good morning.
So I am, like you said, Susana Held, and everybody calls me Susie. I am a proud daughter of immigrants. I'm a first generation, college grad in my family. I'm a sister, I'm a tia, I'm a wife, I'm a caregiver, I'm a friend, and definitely a kid at heart. I have so much fun. I love to explore. And I definitely like to be a person of giving, a person of kindness, and a person of willing to just want to understand and learn from the world and other people.
Beautiful. Thank you so much. I appreciate it. Susie, can you walk us through your professional trajectory up to this point?
Sure. It's funny, every time I talk about this, I feel like I remember something new. So I actually started as a nursing major and made it to my third year to clinicals. And then I was there and I'm like, oh my gosh, I don't think I can do this or want to do this for years, right? And it turns out, so part of being a sister, I'm a sister of a young lady with individual significant disabilities and saw that whole world, right, of growing up in a hospital, going to different therapies, a lot of school meetings with my parents. So I talked to someone that I've kept a relationship and was like, I have no idea what I'm doing with myself. Help. And decided to go work at a therapeutic day school as a 101 aide out of the Northwest Special Education Organization. And while I was there, I had the opportunity to sit in on more individual education plan meetings, IEP meetings. And as I'm talking to this previous teacher, she sends me a list of all these things. And I was like, school psychologist, what is this? So I looked into it, explored it, realized my whole life I've actually interacted with school psychologists without knowing it. And it was at a great time where the world was really shifting from the traditional just testers in schools to a counselor, to a mental health advocate, to a liaison for communities and families and that school community component. So I applied to the program and got in and went with it. So I was a bilingual school psychologist for 10 years. Mostly in high schools, a little bit of middle school. I also did some contractual work for early childhood and preschool out by Minooka, a little more south. Learned a lot from being able to collaborate with the little ones. And just their cuteness was distracting sometimes, but I enjoyed it a lot. And then swinging back to the high schools, I was very, very fortunate to work on some great student support teams where I had to just work with a lot of teachers and so many other leaders in schools as well. And at my last position as a school psychologist, actually at Maine High School, and even at one of my middle schools I was at, I just started seeing the work that some individuals who understood my role as a school psychologist valued my input and started asking that question, Susie, have you thought about doing something more, going into leadership? And I was like, no, I'll be a school psychologist my whole life because I love it. But then in 2018, 2019, I took the plunge. And, you reach a point, and at least from my experience, where I really, I loved what I was doing, cared so much about what I was doing. But I wasn't necessarily challenged in what I was doing anymore. And I wanted to learn more. I'm like, how can I do more? How can I make a bigger impact for my students, for my families? And how can I further support, my teachers who are in the classrooms and all the aides who are doing different things? And so I went for it. I'm like, let's see, I'll do this educational leadership program and figure it out from there. But from the beginning, I knew a dean of students was a great role, kept me with students, still allowed me to collaborate, but also allowed me to do that bigger impact component that I had been seeking.
Beautiful, beautiful. Let me ask you a couple of follow-up questions.
Sure.
Is there anything, before I was an educator, I worked in hospitals as a secretary, and I know that I brought a lot of lessons from that field to education. Is there one or two lessons you brought with you when you explore that area of nursing?
Yes, actually. So I would say 3 of my jobs that I did before that. So my first job ever, I was a captain marshal at a laser tag place. So I always had to coordinate like parties, right? And I think I started there when I was like 16 or 17. And, parents would come and bring their kids, like 9 and under, like sometimes 20 at a time. And there's me, this teenager trying to control, right? So I learned early on to have a lot of patience and to hear out the requests of parents, right? And these were birthday party events, but I had to coordinate. Like I was the person who was put in charge of their children and ensure that they had a great time. So I think one of the lessons from there was, sometimes we would have a rough day at home or, got some bad news. Or I just wasn't feeling it. And I learned quickly that my problems weren't going to go away and that I'd have to go in and put my best face with acknowledging that I was going through something, but I had to make people's day. So I always kind of carried that with me. And then I worked in retail. I only lasted 6 months. So, I worked during the holiday. During the holiday season, right? But from there, I learned a lot of just multitasking, right? And the different personalities that you get coming into, it was at Woodfield Mall. So a lot of different people coming in, right? Ensuring that I acknowledged all the customers that would come in, the responsibility, right, of a cash machine, right? I think that part made me really nervous, right? In the organization of all that, making sure that I followed all the lists, all the protocols, all the processes of opening and closing, of during the store hours. So a lot of multitasking with a lot of memorization too. But that's where I also quickly learned that keeping busy at work and ensuring that if I didn't have like a task to do, to use that time to learn a new skill, because it made the time go so much faster.
Beautiful.
So
What a great lesson, right? For children who just like you and me, sometimes get a job and they're like, oh, I hate this. I can't wait to, instead of seeing it, in here, I'm going to learn some lessons that are going to guide me for the rest of my career.
Yeah, absolutely.
Beautiful.
Yeah,
So from there, in the world of nursing, I specifically ask you nursing because when I did my dissertation, I reviewed how nurses and firefighters and army officials, how they get trained to deal with emotions, right? Because it's such a emotional task. Any lesson you brought from that world to your current world?
Yeah. So in nursing, I think, we all have all of our personal experiences. And since the age of 4, I remember going to hospital so much with my parents because of the needs of my sister. And being on that other side made me be so compassionate. And it also helped me to compose myself in those situations where, as I was training, there's really positive outcomes, right, with healthcare. And then there's also those quick, sad moments of grief. And then there's also that middle, the prolonged cases where families are really dealing or maybe feeling burdened, feeling lost, feeling like there's no more hope. And that compassion and remembering that humanistic side, not just from my personal life, but even from those other jobs I did too, of like, I have to stay calm. Like somebody needs to kind of take a step back and really hear out this family or this patient or the student. Of course, I'm going to go back to student. But at that point, even our group of our class too, though, that really, maybe hadn't experienced something like that. And I learned too that as I was in those clinicals and working with my supervisor nurse or the supervising team, just how much families, for as simple as a kind I can never say this word, gestures.
Yeah, gesture. Yeah.
Goes a long way. Or just offering a cup of water, a little coffee, offering, to come in and check in on the patient, and understanding that outside of that hospital room, these families were going through so much more.
Yes.
So compassion and that kindness and empathy is something that I definitely carried over, from the little kid crying at a birthday party, from someone not being able to return something because they, it surpassed or we just couldn't return it. Like all of those things, for silly as they may sound in an everyday world and functioning, they really do become bigger in different settings. So that's kind of what I used a lot in nursing, and I even still do till this day.
For sure. Thank you so much.
Mm-hmm.
So then you become a school psychologist for 10 years before you go into the deanship. Can you walk us through lessons learned through those 10 years as a bilingual psychologist?
Yeah. So, wow, lessons learned. You obviously, and I, don't want to speak for you, but I feel like a lot of us in any field, when we talk about, our trajectories of how we got there, it's like, they didn't teach us that in school.
For sure.
We didn't read this in the book, right?
That's why we have this podcast, because, you get to learn how people get to accomplish things, and not the case studies only.
Yeah, absolutely. So going in, again, having that lens of being on the other side of the table, of sitting in IEP meetings, I learned that there were going to be many situations where I learned very early on to speak up for what I believed what was right in, but not just because it was my personal opinion, but because it was ethically and legally correct. And I also had the facts for a certain recommendation or the justification for why maybe I wanted to do a certain component when working with a student or working with a classroom, or why I made a suggestion to a family, or why I was making the recommendation of a certain determination in an IEP meeting. And from all of that, I quickly learned how many people go against you in these decisions that I was trained to do, right? So really learning how to be willing to understand that other perspective as to why maybe a disagreement is happening or why a certain request is occurring, and accepting. And that's really hard, right? Because if you really believe in something, or based on your training, it's the correct thing to do or the next logical step, that sometimes there will not be closure. And all you can do is advocate for that piece, right? And learned early too to document anything that I've done or anything that I've suggested as well, so that, I've went into the fields afraid of making decisions. I'm like, oh my God, I'm this adult who's like being trusted and like the expert at the table. And that's scary. So learning that. And then I think the other thing I have learned through being a bilingual school psychologist is being an effective and productive collaborator. I believe a lot of times when we talk about collaboration, there's a lot of just talking back and forth, a lot of conversation, but what really is the end goal? What are we really trying to solve, and what goals are we trying to achieve? So agendas and goals with actual dates is something that helped me so much within my teams. And I learned that from a team member as well, because I would go in there and, make these goals and make these suggestions. I'd be like, I'm going to get this done. And then time flies. By the time
Absolutely.
I get back, I'm like, oh, okay, got to do this. And I think too, one of the ones that I always go back to is, as a bilingual school psychologist, I didn't have the common trajectory of having my own classroom. And it used to hurt me at first when that would be thrown at me. Well, you didn't have your own classroom. You don't know what it's like to run your own room. Right. And it's just like, you're right. I don't know. I've learned to feel comfortable at accepting that truth and acknowledging that they are correct. I've never had to run my own classroom. I've never had to oversee 25 to 38 little human bodies or teenage bodies in the classroom and manage that and teach, and all of the things and tasks that come with that. But I've learned to value that I do come in with a different lens, that I have been in a variety of educational settings and even outside of the traditional schooling, where I can come in, right, and be a new pair of eyes, new pair of listening ears for that teacher or assistant or speech pathologist or assistant principal or principal, and be like, hey, hear me out. Like, this is how we're managing this classroom, or how this teacher is choosing, to manage a classroom, and there's nothing wrong with it, right? But if you're asking for help, then be willing and open-minded to also hear out what I'm seeing, right? And what can I offer for you?
Amen. Thank you for sharing. That's awesome. So you bring this bag of tools and you become a dean. Tell us about that process. I think that that position of dean is so key, especially in this world where both children and parents are hooked on their phones, and they don't get to talk about often, like human values, like what you should not do, what lines you should not cross. So
absolutely.
What lessons have you learned about being in this position with all the experience that you bring?
Yeah, absolutely. So when I was interviewing for dean positions, one of the common questions I received in interviews would be similar with that classroom component, like, you're a school psychologist. You've never been in a classroom, right? So what now? Like, what do you bring so differently? And to be honest, I am so grateful for the many difficult situations on teams, with parents, with school communities I've had, and what I've learned from those experiences of like all the there's so many possibilities that can happen in challenging situations. And I would say my most challenging situations have always been with adults. So bringing that aspect into the dean role and bringing those skills, right, of they're really counseling skills, right?
Yes.
And they're really conversation skills, and applying those when I am working with students or with teachers who are questioning, like, hey, so-and-so keeps using their phone. Hey, so-and-so did this, right? And as much as I tell the students and the teams that I work with currently, as well as like all the adults, like, there's always at least two versions to a story. I am not in your classroom. So if I was in your classroom, if I was a fly in the wall, what would I have heard? What would I have seen? What would other people be doing? What would I have, what would be this interaction? And same thing with the students. And I think with the students, I'm in high school. I think a lot of times, and I have been told a few times, like, wait, you're asking me what happened? And I'm like, yeah. It's important that I know your perspective. Like, what did you experience? What was said? What happened before you ended up here in my office or in my space? And I have realized that throughout the years, right? Like, I feel like I'm lucky where I'm at the age where, phones didn't exist, the internet didn't exist. And it makes me appreciate, right, like those hands-on skills of taking that extra step of actually having to talk to someone. So I tell students too, and I tell parents, like, hey, I'm at a school, but these skills that we're talking about, or this issue, is a learning opportunity, right? And having a restorative conversation about what actually happened, what are we learning from it? And I'm always upfront with the students and families, like, I have to hold you accountable, right? That's why I need to understand your role as well, so that I can make an informed decision of how we're going to move forward and how are we going to work with this together. It's been lovely. It's worked great for me.
That's awesome. Thank you so much. One more follow-up question. You mentioned about restorative conversations. This is a topic that is everywhere, yet is quite difficult to grasp for generations of educators like you and me. Absolutely. Who went to school, and it was like the expectation was that you will teach and the students will learn and go home and do their homework, and parents will support them, and kids will be respectful when they come to school, right? So restorative practice comes, and some educators think, well, wait, I'm here to teach English or math or science. I'm not here to restore the peace. Can you talk about the importance of restorative conversations, restorative practices, and how this has influenced perhaps your work?
Yeah, absolutely. And you mentioned it perfectly, right? Like, I feel like a lot of, either veteran educators or people like us who have been trained in a certain way, they're like, well, my job is not to restore the peace. My job is not to pass around a talking stick. I'm a teacher. I'm a group leader. This is what I do. And so I always, I had to educate myself, right? Because I think I heard so many theories about what it was, right? And what we're supposed to be doing. And what it really comes down to is another common topic of relationships, right? And the reality is that we all come from different spaces, from different backgrounds, from different stories, from different journeys and trajectories of how us as adults have gotten there, but also how our students and families get to us and how they come into our schools. When I am talking with adults, I always mention, now as a dean, right, or being in a leadership role, depending on who I'm talking to, I always give the example of like, when you come into my office, like you want my full attention, you want me to hear you out, like your perspective, your reasoning as to why. How do you think your students walk in every day if they had a rough day or if they're having a great day? What do you think they want to feel when they walk into your room, right? I typically get a lot of like, well, it's the classroom. They should be ready to learn. They should be able to come in, right? And I'm like, well, have you ever had a situation where you're sitting in the parking lot or you had a bad moment, either with your child or your dog wasn't listening to you when you had to get him for a walk because you had to get to work, right? Like how do those things impact your overall mood when you have to come into work and teach a classroom? So if we have a student, if they have a great day, they're going to come in and do their thing, right? But if you have a group of students who maybe missed their bus, maybe they missed a ride, maybe they didn't get breakfast that day, woke up late and it ruined their day, right? How do those very basic conversations impact that? And I always am very intentional of stating, like, you can't just ask or just say good morning. Actively listen and actively respond, right? And again, that's where kind of like those therapeutic skills come in of that summarization component, right? Like mention something. It doesn't matter how tiny it is, but also bearing in mind that you get them every single day for a whole academic school year. I get them once in a while, right? So that restorative component, right, of that everything is a process. And that you want to, if whether it's a positive or a negative interaction, right? Because you're going to research shows we mostly remember the negative things that come into our life. How do you take that negative into a positive memory that you acknowledge that something happened, whether it's a small group, individual student in your class, right? We remember more how people make us feel. And that's important. So those are a lot of the conversations that I've had, like even in the large group, right? Of really being intentional in our conversations and our interactions with our students, but with the adults too that we interact with every single day. You're not going to like everybody and not everybody's going to like you. Amen. But how do we learn to live in that same space, and how do we learn to just be nice to each other and come in and do what we do best?
That's awesome. Thank you so much, Jose.
This podcast is a proud member of the Teach Better Podcast Network. Better today, better tomorrow, and the podcast to get you there. Explore more podcasts at www.teachbetterpodcastnetwork.com. Now let's get back to the episode.
So, like in Back to the Future, if you could go back to any of the positions you have held, what would the Susie of today tell the Susie of back then?
Wow. I think I would have to tell myself that I think fear is the biggest thing that I experienced for the future. And I think fear is one of those emotions that are not easy to admit, but I'm just naturally a feeler. I'm an emotional person. I could be very composed, but once I'm in a space that's comfortable, like I'll lose it. Like I've cried in my office. I've cried on the drive in, the drive
Me
home.
too.
Because certain situation. I'm frustrated, I'm mad. I just figure it's healthier than like throwing something. But fear, I think that if I can go back to any position that I would go in, I would remind myself that I'm going to have some really difficult and uncomfortable experiences and that I'm going to be afraid, but that in the end, I'm going to be able to work through those, that there are going to be people who come along the way who genuinely care, right? And of course, right, you live and you learn. I now accept that. Now my parents tell me I do go back and tell them, like, I know, you told me so, Susanita, you said so. And I acknowledge that now. But if I could go back, I would really tell myself to not be afraid of what I'm capable of and to not be afraid of what the reactions or the responses are from other people, because they don't define me. They're experiences that you go through and that you learn from. And how do you do better with that, right? How do you improve? And I think for the good early on years, I was just, maybe people didn't know it, maybe I didn't show it, but there would be times where I would just be terrified of a certain case, of a certain situation. And I look back now and I'm kind of like, that was so silly. Completely okay. The world goes on, right?
Yes. Amen. Great reflection. Thank you so much. Okay, so reading books is such a luxury, and I bet that you have a favorite for a fiction and a favorite for a nonfiction. If you had to give them to a loved one, what would those two books be?
This is so funny. I had such a hard time. I came up to my bookshelf. I was like, oh my God, what do I pick? If I had to pick one, and I actually went based on like, what is the book that I have most gifted? I actually have to thank a friend who gifted me this book. So growing up, I didn't have pets. I actually wasn't a kid who ever wanted a pet. Like, people find that odd, but I just was like, no, like then I have to take care of it and there's a responsibility, right? So she actually gifted me The Art of Racing in the Rain by Garth Stein. I believe it came out in 2006, 2007, or 2008. It's a movie now. Read the book first if you haven't read it. It's a fictional book, and it's from the perspective of a dog. And his owner is a race car driver, professional race car driver who has a family. And the first time I read it, I just thought it was really, really good. I'm like, this is amazing. Like the end, I'm a crier. I like cried. I was like, oh my goodness, right? Like the lessons from that perspective of a dog. And it was just so creative and so intelligent in the way that it was written. And I love like racing and like seeing all that and, you know, experiencing it and all those crazy experiences. So I'm like, this is really cool. Right. And, I've read it a couple times, and I read it in between another time. And every time I read it, I pick up something new. And even though it's fiction, there's different experiences that the dog goes through with its owner and the family. And the family is composed of a husband and a wife, and then eventually a child. And how those different life changes and milestones impact the pet, and why the dog, Enzo, I'm sorry, that is not the dog's name. I'm thinking of the whole book now because I'm getting so excited. Why the dog wants to now experience in a future life the human experience. I reread the book. My sister passed, my youngest sister, and I've always been a person who believes in signs. So I reread this book because loss happens in the book as well. And I don't think I ever felt so much when I read a book when I did it this time. And it's right, a dog's perspective. Like how cool would it be to go into like any pet's like brain and figure that out? But that was, if you haven't had the opportunity, The Art of Racing in the Rain.
Fascinating. Thank you so much. Wow. And what about nonfiction?
Oh man. So this one was tough. I don't read a lot of nonfiction books. A lot of the ones that I do read are, recommendations are also gifted. And I kind of went between two, a memoir, because it was The Glass Castle. She is a journalist by Janet Walls. And it was the first book of a memoir that I read that was written as storytelling of a successful person who was just so vulnerable in sharing their childhood experiences. And essentially, the way I understood it the first time I read it was kind of like living in this lie without knowing that there was like a mental health component that impacted her upbringing, and how those experiences helped her become this journalist and then gave her the courage to write her story about it. So I've read it a couple times as well. It was also the first like nonfiction memoir book I read that actually was written by what I would say is a white woman. Everything else I've read has been like immigrant stories and those experiences. And it really was an eye-opener for me. And I read it as an adult. So getting that perspective helped me a lot. And I would say my second favorite that I have here as a auto was Michelle Obama's Becoming. My mom actually gifted it to me. And it wasn't one that I was like, I'm going to go out and buy it and read it. But again, as an adult, right? And obviously from Chicago, I've never left. And it just seeing that perspective, right? Like you always see, like Michelle Obama or anybody who's fairly well known and they have this life. And we forget, right? I think it's so easy to forget that they have their own lives and their own experiences and what's that like. And a lot of her experiences really resonated with me. And, like living in little village and then Bridgeport, and then like the things that she would mention, it just like took me back. And even as an adult, right, the challenges that you face with yourself, with your partner, with your family, and how you make certain choices and how they impact you, whether they be positive or negative. So that's one that it's more recent. Yeah. But I read it quickly because I was just so hooked by it. And I'm so grateful that it was gifted to me because it got me to read it and get that perspective. Mm-hmm.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it. Susie, who is or who are your biggest influences?
Oh, wow. My number one, for as long as probably since about sixth grade. My youngest sister, Joanna, we called her JoJo, who passed away. As I mentioned, she had cerebral palsy, nonverbal, non-ambulatory, and depended on us for everything. Actually, tomorrow would be her 33rd birthday. So it's kind of, one of those weeks where I have a lot of roller coaster of emotions. But I think too, working in schools as well, you hear all of these different perceptions or stereotypes of individuals who are nonverbal. And I think many times it saddened me to hear what people believed of individuals with disabilities, especially those who depend on other people. But I learned very early on as a kid, right? I didn't understand, like, why does my family have to be different? But she really influenced me to use my voice because I have one, to be grateful for my physical ability to be able to get up and get myself a cup of water, be able to, scratch a little itch, and seeing her and my family, kind of go through like the whole education component, like really, once I realized what a school psychologist was, and being in education, I was like, I could be that person. I'm bilingual. I can help like all of my non-English speaking, but Spanish speaking families. I can educate them. I can inform them. And anytime I worked in a school with any student, but especially, the life skills or transition programs or whatever we call our programs, right, that do provide education and services to this very specialized population, I always went into those classrooms, and I still do wherever I go. How would I want people that I entrusted my sister to treat her? So a lot of my work, my everyday, there isn't a day that doesn't go by where something comes across, and that's what I think about. I think about her a lot. Other people that have influenced me, obviously my parents, we're just have very high expectations, sacrificed a lot for me and my sisters to be here and be successful, whatever anybody's definition of success is. But for me, it was always, I have an opportunity to get an education, and what am I going to do with that? So they're huge. And I think as a professional, my sixth grade teacher, who I actually still keep in touch with,
Wow.
is Connie Bjornstead. She was the first white female teacher I ever had. And she believed in me from the moment she met me. I don't know what it was, but she just made this connection with me over, I think it was over Mickey Mouse, because I love Mickey and had this dream of going to Disney. Probably, I think I do remember a conversation about that, but she just always pushed me and challenged me. And thinking back and reflecting throughout the years, she doesn't live in Illinois, but we've kept a great relationship. We see each other. Just really always had me thinking, right? Had these wheels turning, like, Susie, what's going to be your next step? What are you going to do? And she was just like a model. Like, she just, in her classroom, it was always very welcoming, like very genuine, like colorful and fun. And if, some of us were misbehaving, like, she just had this way of like not making you feel bad about yourself. And like, what could you do differently next time? So talk about restorative, right? Like, she was already doing that without knowing that's what it was.
Wow.
Yeah, so those are have been my biggest influences. And currently I have to talk about Dean Nellie Diaz at Maine East High School. She challenged me to be a better school psychologist, to be a better educator. And if it wasn't for her, I probably would not have pursued going into educational leadership.
Wow.
She's a shaker and a mover and inspiration. And never asked us or my team to do anything that she wasn't willing to do. And that's something that I've carried over as well.
Beautiful. Thank you so much. Susie, as on impostor syndrome, we all have this. We all deal with this, right? We all feel like, oh, I'm not good enough, or I can't do that. That's too difficult for me. How do you address this?
Oh man, this is difficult. So this is actually something I've been thinking a lot about. So earlier this year, they did like a leadership book club study at my job, and we read "Lead from Where You Are" by Joe Sanfilippo. And the one thing that stood out to me, because I am so guilty of this, and I've been working so hard of doing this, is I'd always be like, well, I'm just a school psychologist. And I remember I read those paragraphs. I had to have at least read them like 5 times, because I was like, oh my goodness, like, this is me all the time. I'm just this, I'm just a dean at a school. And there are times, right, where I sit in a room and I just like, why me? Like, why am I here? And I've really learned to embrace, there's always these processes, right? Like, we have to go to school, we have to get our diplomas, but you can't just get the job with the diploma. You actually have to sit for the exam and pass it and get nervous about all of that. And when I think back to me as a little kid and where I am now, I realize that it's been my own doing that has gotten me where I'm at, that I have earned my space at a table, that I've earned my space in a room, that I've earned my interview. It's not because somebody did something for me. Sure, maybe people gave me recommendations and things like that, but I've done my own work for myself and have accepted the failures that I've learned from to do better and to learn from that. So when after reading the book, I was like, I need to stop doing that to myself. Like, Susie, like, you are you, girl. Like, you did it. Si se pudo. Like, you're here. Yes. And what more are you going to do? I think now too, when I talk with students, though, I've really used that with them, right? Like, I do have students come into my office and it's like, no, miss, well, it's because I'm just this grocery worker right now. And I'm like, you're not just that. I'm like, I can come in there and eat something, right? Like, you're the person who's helping someone else. Like, do not minimize what you're currently doing, because that little bit that you're doing or big that you're doing could be such a huge impact for somebody else. And so many times, I think that's what's difficult too in our field and as well as in other fields, right? That we do so much, and many times we don't see that immediate gratification. So I've been very intentional. I like to journal a lot, and I've been intentional in journaling about something that I would have impacted me if I was on the other side, in the hope that one day someone will look back and say, you know what? I don't remember her name, but this lady with the big old earrings or the heels said this or did this, right? So reminding myself, right, that I've earned my spot, I've earned my space. And I think I've had conversations where some people don't agree with that. But that's what's important to me. That's what keeps me going. So I have to remind myself, like, you did it, Susie. Like, you're here and you can do more. Like, what are you going to do next?
Amen. Thank you so much. That's awesome. What a great message also for like for students who often come with such a lack of confidence, and nobody has talked to them that if with a little bit of effort they can accomplish so much.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it. So let's talk about productivity. All successful people behind the scenes do all these marometas and going around organizing, right? Before we go in the stage and everybody sees the beauty, the end product. So let's talk about how do you get organized to get things done and still live a fructiferous life?
Yeah, absolutely. So I've gotten better about not using 10 million Post-it notes. Used to be my go-to. They're like, where's my Post-it? I'm definitely, I know I'm a visual person, and I also do so well when I write. Like, I remember so much when I physically write, not taking a little note on my phone. I forget to look at the note. I forget to look at the reminders on my phone. So to be productive, obviously I have to keep my work calendar. So that helps me right when I'm there at work. So I keep that. But then the extra stuff that I do for myself, I no longer keep separate physical calendars of my personal and work life, because the one time I did that, I triple booked myself.
Yeah, for sure.
And got nowhere. So I have a list, like I have one notebook that I have, and each day is a different color, maybe highlighted in different colors as well for different things, because I just remember. I do so much better remembering things that I have to do if I write them down. There's something about a pen or a pencil on a paper and me, the physical act, that I will be somewhere and I'll be like, oh, that's right. I remember I have to do this.
David Allen says that the quote is, I believe, the brain is great to generate ideas, but terrible to keep them. So that's why he says the first step is capture your ideas.
Yeah. So I definitely do a lot of idea capturing. And I do, I like to write my ideas too with like a date, like that I do it. And if I have a due date, I always start off with the due date, because then I know like, hey, I have to get this done by a certain day, or else I forget to look at the due date, and that's just not going to be helpful. So that's what I do. And I make sure, you know, I've been so much better about boundaries. I have to admit it, I'm someone who I would stay till 7:00 at work to do stuff, because then I would be like, that way I could just go home and do nothing. But then I'd come home and I've given my best. I've given all my energy to my work, and not to the space where people are excited. Not that people aren't excited to see me at work, but you know, to my family, or when I go visit my parents or something like that. So I've been so much better about setting those boundaries and accepting that I'm not going to get everything done in a day. And I'm so much more productive if I actually take a break than trying to like push through something, because then I'm like going la la land, dreamland. So that's important, like having a cutoff time for myself. Like I will tell myself, like if I'm going to stay, I will look at the clock and I'll be like, all right, I'm going to give myself 1 hour. And in 1 hour, you can't look at your phone. You can't check your email. You have to tackle this and get as far as you can.
Good. Beautiful. So when you have to send messages to the people that you work with, educators and stuff like that, did you just sit down and write it? Do you think about it? Like, what is your process of communicating with others? Especially, I'm assuming that a lot of cases sometimes is very sensitive, because a teacher might have sent a student and the teacher feels offended, and you have to somehow restore. Like, what is the magic behind that email?
Yeah. So I would say that if it's a sensitive situation, I have to admit that I don't typically respond immediately, because when I read that email, it comes with emotion, and I have then my own personal reaction, right? It's my personal reaction to reading the message, rather than taking a step back of actually taking in that message and being like, okay, where is this individual coming from? What is the situation? And how do I respond in a way that is validating what they're saying, but that also justifies how I have to respond, right? And I've learned that because in other situations, I've like started to type a response and then I read it, I'm like, oh, Susie, no, do not send that. Because it's a reactive response. So I'm pretty good I make a point to look at things, like I'll scan emails because a lot of them are, they're electronic messages now. So I will scan those and just I have to prioritize. Like that's the way to get things done too. Like I have to prioritize situations. Obviously, if it's an urgent matter, I have to act. But if it's something that I know can wait, I have to give myself space to think about and process to make a decision that's going to be informed, but that's also going to be supportive. And I also believe in the importance of giving the other person who's having the experience to have a breathing space, yes. Right? Because when something happens, like we react, we can get fumed, we can, and then also giving them the opportunity to process a situation is important as well. So I definitely do that in my practice when responding to messages and communicating things out.
Yes, absolutely. Let me ask you, when I see you recently completed your doctorate, what lessons learned about the dissertation process, and what advice do you have for whoever is out there, yes. Starting chapter 1 and they're like, what the heck I'm doing? What is your advice?
Yes, I think, I guess if I had to do it all over again, okay. It's actually not even my own advice. It's the advice that my chair gave me. And I was like, why didn't you give me this advice sooner? I really wish, I think I focused so much on the process, right? Like you focus on the chapters and what you need to do. Some chapters are easier to write notes. For example, chapter 3, methodology. Oh Lord, that was hard for me. Like, it's just so dull. I'm like, like, how do I make this sound exciting? Right. My suggestion is, and it sounds like a lot, but a half hour of day, whether it's writing down your ideas or typing them up, it doesn't have to sound great. It doesn't have to sound beautiful, grammatically correct. But when I started doing that, I was so much more effective with my writing process. Because there were times where I would sit down and be like, I'm going to block out half the day to write. And then I'd be sitting there and I'd be like, well, how do I want to say this? Oh, the other day I had this idea. But as soon as I started, actually, I just kept a pad of paper. I actually still have that pad of paper. Where I literally would write, I would write chapter 1, put my little note, remember to know this sort of data, or remember to mention this methodology that was considered. That helped me so much then. And it evolved to me once the actual writing process happened, and you have to do all the drafts and stuff. Mm-hmm. I started doing that all in there. And then I would go back and I would make it sound more professional, more intellectual, more flowy. That was huge. And basically really being intentional, dedicating half hour, an hour, if possible, a day to doing that and getting it done. And don't feel bad about sounding repetitive, because that's going to happen. And a lot of it does involve that. So there's nothing wrong with repetitiveness. It's just a matter of getting that message across and what you're researching and why and your outcomes. And what do you do with those outcomes, whether they were what you wanted or not.
Beautiful. Thank you. Let's talk about other activities. I see you mentioned in your Twitter about traveling and photography. Tell us about that.
Yes. Yeah. So this is funny because recently I made my 6th grade dreams come true. 6th grade, again, with Miss Bjornstad, was the year that I really got into history, and she just had this way of teaching. And I remember I got assigned to Egypt. Oh my God, I fell in love with Egypt. And I remember telling her, one day I'm going to make it to Egypt. And when I do, I'm going to tell you. And I made a passport to Egypt. We had to make a project. Wow. She was really good about you showing your mastery of skills and learning in creative ways. And I made a passport. I still have that passport. So I went to Egypt. It took about 25 years, but I made it to Egypt this past December.
Wow.
I took a picture in front of a pyramid with my Egypt passport from 6th grade and sent it to her. So that's something I've always, in 6th grade, I learned that I wanted to see the world. My family was not, traveling was just not a thing one, we couldn't afford it.
Mhm.
But I remember coming home and telling my parents, like, I want to see the world. Like, there's so much out there, and no quiero que me cuenten, right? Like, I don't want people to tell me. I want to experience it and see it and smell it and feel it. So I'm very blessed that I've been able to do that for a couple of years now, with my husband, and just adventuring and seeing that. And, I also wanted to be a photographer. In high school, I took darkroom photography. So for years, actually, even in undergrad, all 4 years, I did darkroom photography. Obviously, everything's more digital now, but it's something that I always enjoyed. There's just something about like being able to capture a moment or a landscape and just freezing it in time, and being able to go back and look at it. I love the idea of just like things, right? And a lot of the photography that I do hobby-based is the things that I know I'm not going to be able to see every day. Just being able to have it. And I love the black and white, because I love to think about, like, if I go to an art museum or an art gallery, photography gallery, I do like to think about, like, you know, what kind of day was this? Like, what was the tree? Like, was it fall? Was it summer? You know, what color are these flowers? Like, I love the thinking process too of just being able to escape in a photograph and having that memory, and really taking me back to a moment. So when friends ask me to photograph, or I take their picture, I love the candid photography. I'll do pose photography for people, but the candidness, right, of the way somebody is looking at something or looking at someone, or the way somebody's looking at each other. There's just something, I don't even know what the word is, but like, there's just something I feel like chills sometimes when I look back and I'm like, wow, like I took that and now I can gift this to someone and surprise them with this moment. Yeah, love it.
Fascinating. Thank you so much. Susie, this has been such a great conversation. Any other thoughts you would like to share with the listeners of the show?
I think like other thoughts I would share, something that I think maybe unsolicited advice, because I wished I would have done this for myself. I really wished I would have lived my life or made decisions, whether personal or professional, without regrets. That's been huge for me. There's been times where I've thought back and I'm kind of like, why didn't I do that? You know, I can't go back now and do it, right? Or there's been times where I do something and I'm like, oh man, that did not go as planned, but now I know, right? So having no regrets, I think is huge. And like in all aspects of life, if you want to do something, do it while you can. You know, if you have the ability to do so, because you just don't know what tomorrow's going to bring. I don't know how I'm going to be a few years from now, and I don't ever want to have to look back and be like, why didn't I try? Like, why didn't I give that a shot? Why didn't I call that someone to thank them? Why didn't I go for that walk? Or, you know, had the chance to go visit someone and I didn't. Yeah, definitely a life without regrets in all aspects.
Beautiful. What a great advice. Thank you so much, Susie. This has been a great time. I have learned so much from you. I appreciate you took a little bit of time to share your wisdom and your productivity.
Thank you.
And have a happy Saturday, okay?
You too.
Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to Wisdom and Productivity, the podcast of Dr. Efraín Martinez.
Chulo.
And LF.production. Chill out.